Violence against women and girls, and what men have to do with it. In this video, we'll briefly be exploring the global issues of interpersonal violence and men's roles in perpetuating that violence. This form of violence, sometimes called interpersonal violence, gender-based violence, or another form of hate crime, is a global issue. It's not something locally in one culture, community, ethnic group, region, or country, but something we see around the world. From domestic violence to honor killings, sexual harassment, sexual assault, dowry deaths, and human trafficking. So some may ask, well, violence against women, how is that a man's issue? It's violence against women or violence against girls. And the role of patriarchy plays such an integral part of this. There's a basic understood principle that women are men's property. John's cow, John's dog, John's house, John's woman. A woman, by the mere fact of taking her husband's name, becomes part of his property. Oftentimes she loses her whole identity. There's an understanding that a man is believed to be entitled to wield authority over a woman and punish her. So there's a lack of internal power for women. The family is viewed as private. Outsiders should not interfere. Don't air your dirty laundry. And women really being regarded as inferior to men. And those are just, above the iceberg view that we can see. One of the great examples of this is the rule of thumb. Now, some of you may say this when what you really mean is a general rule. It happens all the time. Rule of thumb actually is derived from English law that allowed a man to beat his property, his dog, his cow, his child, his wife, with a stick so long as it was no thicker than his thumb. So take a moment, look at your own thumb. Imagine an average man's thumb and what kind of damage that can do to a human being. So we begin to see how patriarchy plays an integral role and was allowed and supported through most of society in the world. And what kind of women does this happen to? What kind of girls does this happen to? Well, we know that violent acts against women and girls within families are ignored, tolerated, or given approval in many parts of the world, and that's regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, income, or any other factor. The largest percentage of female homicide victims are killed by an intimate partner. Now compare that to male homicide victims, which there are more male homicide victims than female homicide victims. But they are not, by and large, killed by their intimate partners. They are killed by other men who are not intimate partners. And the American Medical Association says that interpersonal violence is the single greatest cause of injury to women. There are many reasons why interpersonal violence is so prevalent in all societies. Beyond what I've already mentioned, there are socio-political and cultural causes. Societies often approve and reward male dominance. There are rigid gender roles and expectations in various cultures. There's social learning theory, and there's individual personalities, feelings of powerlessness by people who abuse, fear of abandonment by those who abuse, and these things lead to abuse. It's also important to note that this applies to lesbian relationships too, due to internalization of societal values of hierarchy and dominance. And what about the cost? Well, the World Health Organization reports the cost of interpersonal violence in the U.S. alone at more than $300 billion a year. Cost to victims at more than $500 billion a year. And when you combine that, that's the equivalent of nearly 10% of the U.S.'s gross domestic product. So if you begin to take that multiplier to countries around the world, as we know that this does not occur in one place, but in all countries it's similar. When we use this multiplier around the world, we can begin to see just how impactful around the world interpersonal violence is on strictly a financial note. So how do we begin to address and reduce this public health issue around the world? For a long time, we looked at who this woman was, this survivor, this victim of interpersonal abuse, and we weren't able to find unifying characteristics. It wasn't that she had a certain upbringing or socioeconomic class, And then we began to look at the abusers. And above is work by Mark McYoung in regard to the personality traits of abusers and rapists. So take a moment as we go through this list to reflect on what shapes and characteristics that we see that are very common in abusers. The insensitivity for others, the emphasis on themselves, narcissistic features. Not someone who just has a narcissistic personality disorder, but narcissistic features. A person who belittles others either in thoughts, attitudes, or behaviors. Someone who focuses a great amount of their time on negative behaviors and comments. Someone who is hostile and threatening in their language. Someone who bullies. Someone who is excessively angry, brooding, wanting revenge, obsesses, is extremely moody, has mood swings, can have emotional and physical tantrums, is a jock or gorilla mentality, is a very mean drunk, and alcohol and drug use are involved in a large percentage, although not all, but a large percentage of abuse as well. While a predator, rapist, abuser does not have to have all these characteristics, they will have a cluster of these. And if you take a moment to review, hopefully you'll begin to understand and have a picture of who this individual might be. As we begin to look at partner abuse, it's important to understand some basic facts. More than 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced physical violence in their lives in an interpersonal matter. And somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 10 girls under the age of 18 have been forced to have sex. That means they have been raped, sexually assaulted, and or molested based on their age. We know that patterns of abuse increase in severity over time. These victims and survivors of abuse are often isolated from others purposefully by their partners. In 2013 alone, there were over 8,000 reported dowry deaths. And I want to emphasize reported. We are unclear on honor killings. It's very hard to estimate, but we guess about 5,000 women per year worldwide, and it's not uncommon, and there's a lot of pressure for the woman or girl to commit suicide. As we look at partner abuse, the riskiest time for a woman or girl to be murdered is when she tries to escape the relationship. It's a form of intimate terrorism. And although both women and men are violent towards their partners, men inflict the most serious harm and are 90 to 95% likely the perpetrators in such violence. Obviously, there's also emotional and psychological abuse that goes along with this. And unfortunately, violence starts early and often in young girls' lives. It's part of an estimated 20% of all dating relationships in the United States. Oftentimes, women and girls say they stay in relationships because they think the violence means that he really cares. If he didn't, he wouldn't bother. And adolescent girls who have experienced violence report other problems such as suicide attempts. Staying in an abusive relationship is dangerous, but so is trying to terminate and avoid it. And again, it's important to note that these are not issues just facing heterosexual relationships, but in all dating relationships. Factors that predict intimate partner abuse in lesbian couples are similar in many ways to those that predict it in heterosexual couples. Incident rates are also similar, between 25 to 50%. That includes both physical and verbal abuse. And reporting of prior abuse. So we know in 2003, 88% of victims of abuse and 91% in 2004 experienced prior incidents of abuse, with the majority of them reporting having experienced more than 10 prior incidents. Risk factors for intimate partner violence among lesbian, gay, and bisexual persons are similar to those found for heterosexual couples and include, but are not limited to, racial minority, lower socioeconomic status, being young, deaf or hard of hearing, having substance abuse, low self-esteem, risky sexual behavior, victim-blaming attitudes, lacking power in relationship, achievement anxiety, attachment anxiety, being HIV positive, having a history of abuse or witnessing intimate partner violence, being in social networks of victimization, a history of sex work or incarceration. And as stated, internalized homophobia and stigma consciousness are additional risk factors for lesbian, bisexual, and trans women. Battered women are not the only victims of abuse. It is estimated that anywhere between 3.3 million and 10 million children witness domestic violence annually. Slightly more than half of female victims of intimate violence live in households with children under 12. And research demonstrates that exposure to violence can have serious negative effects on children's development. Thus, the reason why in many states, regions, and countries, laws have been added to the books to address the issues of the violence that children are experiencing in the home. And coming back to our understanding of patriarchy and the patriarchal views that impact the social construct of owning and treating women as property, we look at the sex-selective abortion, infanticide, and other forms of neglect of girls. In China, about 12% of all female potential births were aborted or otherwise unaccounted for during the one-child policy. 25% of women in China engaged in sex-selective abortion. In India, sex-selective abortions are very common, and as many as 8 million female fetuses were aborted over the past decade. In many countries, girls are discriminated against in nutrition and access to medical care, and when one has to choose between feeding 2 children, it is the male child that gets fed first. So whether it is sex-selective abortions, female infanticide, allowing little girls to starve to death so that boys can eat, or leaving little girls in fields to die, this systematic neglect of female children stems from and is perpetuated by the devaluation of female lives everywhere around the world.